Nestled in the heart of Ohio, Greenview was the kind of suburban neighborhood that seemed immune to the chaos of the outside world. Rows of two-story houses with neatly trimmed lawns lined the streets, families waving to each other on their way to work or school. It was the American dream captured in the stillness of the everyday. But behind the neatly painted white shutters of 224 Cedar Lane, an unthinkable storm had been brewing for years. The Stevens household, occupied by 46-year-old Linda Stevens and her only child, 22-year-old Derek, appeared unremarkable from the outside. Linda, a middle school teacher, lived for the routine of her days, her morning coffee, a stack of homework papers to grade, and the occasional weekend spent gardening in the yard. Derek, on the other hand, had become increasingly withdrawn over the past year. There were no outward signs of trouble, no loud arguments or strange visitors. But what neighbors didn't see were the suffocating tensions that had quietly poisoned the mother-son relationship. Derek had dropped out of college, moved back home, and struggled to find his place in the world. Each day felt like another reminder of his failures. Linda, a woman of high expectations, never stopped reminding him of the life she had imagined for him, one that he wasn't living up to. The facade of normalcy in the Stevens home began to crack, leading to the night that would forever change Greenview. It was a Thursday evening in mid-October, the air outside crisp with the first hints of fall. Inside 224 Cedar Lane, the atmosphere was stifling. The house, dimly lit by warm lamps and filled with the smell of leftover dinner, seemed like a haven. But for Derek, it felt like a prison. The night had begun uneventfully. Linda sat at the dining table, grading papers as usual. Derek was upstairs in his room, staring at the ceiling. The thoughts that had plagued him for months now began to swirl uncontrollably. The pressure, the constant feeling of being trapped, being scrutinized by his own mother, weighed heavily on him. He had no job, no future, and in his mind, no escape. Something inside Derek snapped that night. It wasn't a single event that pushed him over the edge, but rather the culmination of years of silent resentment, unmet expectations, and internal chaos. Quietly he descended the stairs, moving like a shadow through the house. In the kitchen, he grabbed the largest kitchen knife, its steel blade glinting under the soft glow of the overhead lights. The noise of the television playing faintly in the background drowned out the sounds of his movement. Derek walked toward the dining room where Linda sat, still unaware of his presence. He didn't hesitate. In an instant, he was behind her, and the knife plunged into her back, the sharp steel cutting through flesh and muscle. Linda's body jerked forward, knocking papers to the ground. Blood sprayed across the table, staining the pile of graded homework as her body went limp. Derek stood there, staring down at her lifeless form, his breath steady but his mind racing. The house, once so warm and familiar, now felt like a tomb. The once quiet house was now eerily still. Derek stood over his mother's lifeless body, blood pooling around her chair. The knife, slick and warm in his trembling hand, dropped to the hardwood floor with a muted clatter. For a moment, the world seemed frozen. Derek's mind, foggy and distant, refused to comprehend what he had just done. He stared at Linda, her body slumped over the table, her lifeblood spreading like ink across the papers she'd been grading. The realization hit him like a wave, but there was no immediate sense of panic, no rush of regret. Instead, it was a strange, unsettling calm. Methodically, Derek moved to the kitchen sink, scrubbing his hands with a clinical detachment as the water ran red. His reflection in the window above the sink was hollow, empty. In his head, a singular thought took root. What now? He hadn't planned beyond this. The act itself had been an eruption of all the pent-up anger and despair, but there had been no thought of what to do next. As he wiped his hands on a dish towel, his eyes flicked to the clock, 10:12 p.m. The neighborhood was dark, most families likely settling in for the night. No one had heard a thing. With a deep breath, Derek returned to the dining room. He needed to think. Carefully stepping around his mother's body, he grabbed a chair from the opposite side of the table and sat down, his mind churning through the possibilities. He knew it wouldn't be long before someone noticed her absence. Linda's co-workers, her friends, they would wonder why she didn't show up to work the next morning. But tonight, for these few precious hours, Derek still had control. He stared at the crimson-soaked scene before him, his mother's lifeless eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling. The image should have horrified him, but all he felt was an odd sense of release, as though the weight he had carried for years had been lifted. But the question still loomed. What was he going to do? The urgency of his situation began to creep into Derek's thoughts. He needed to act quickly before the calm dissolved into full-blown panic. As long as the body was there, evidence of what he had done remained clear, tangible. He needed to get rid of it. Derek's first instinct was to clean the house. He couldn't leave any trace of what had happened. Rushing to the closet in the hallway, he grabbed cleaning supplies, bleach, a mop, rags. His hands were steady as he worked, wiping down the bloodstains, mopping the floor, and scrubbing the table. The smell of bleach filled the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. Slowly, the visible traces of his crime began to fade, but there was still so much left to do. Linda's body lay awkwardly, face down on the table, her back marred by the deep stab wound. Derek knew moving her would be difficult, but it had to be done. He considered his options. The basement. The backyard. A shallow grave would be too risky. Neighbors could notice the disturbed earth, and burying her clothes would only give him a temporary reprieve. But if he disposed of the body elsewhere, he might be able to buy more time. His thoughts settled on the trunk of his car. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it would allow him to get the body out of the house. He would figure out where to take her later. With grim determination, he returned to the dining room, pulling a large plastic tarp from the garage. Derek wrapped his mother's body in the tarp, her limbs heavy and uncooperative as he maneuvered them into place. He tied the edges securely, making sure no blood would seep through. The task took longer than he had anticipated, each step requiring more effort as the weight of his actions bore down on him. With the body finally encased, he dragged the tarp toward the back door, the sound of it scraping across the floor breaking the silence of the house. The backyard was dark, the moon casting faint shadows across the lawn. Derek opened the trunk of his sedan and struggled to lift the body, his muscles straining as he heaved the lifeless form inside. He slammed the trunk shut, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. For a brief moment he stood there, breathless, staring at the car, as if waiting for anything to happen. But the world remained quiet, oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded within the walls of 224 Cedar Lane. Derek knew this was only the beginning. The real test would come in the hours ahead. The house was now eerily spotless, the scent of bleach clinging to the air, as Derek stood motionless in the driveway, staring at the car. The body of his mother lay hidden in the trunk, wrapped tightly in the tarp, the final evidence of the violent act that had taken place hours earlier. His mind raced as he climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine rumbling to life. He had no clear destination. Panic slowly began to creep in, gnawing at the edges of his forced calm. Where could he go? What could he possibly do with the body? The streets were dark, illuminated only by occasional streetlights, as he drove aimlessly through the sleeping town. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white in the dim glow of the dashboard. He drove for nearly an hour, the suburban streets giving way to rural roads lined with trees and wide, empty fields. The further he went, the more isolated he felt. But no location seemed right. He couldn't bury her here. The ground was too hard, too exposed. Dumping the body seemed reckless, but he was running out of options and time. Each mile felt like another weight added to the crushing realization of what he had done. Finally, he turned off onto a narrow, unpaved road that led deeper into the woods. It was a forgotten path, one he remembered from his childhood when he and his friends used to ride their bikes through these trees, imagining it as some distant world. Now it seemed like the perfect place to disappear, to leave behind what he had done. The car rolled to a stop, the headlights cutting through the darkness ahead, revealing only the tangled underbrush of the forest. Derek killed the engine and sat there for a moment, the silence overwhelming. His heartbeat thudded in his chest as he glanced into the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the trunk. He knew what had to happen next. The air was cold, biting through Derek's thin jacket as he stood behind the car, staring into the black woods before him. He opened the trunk, and the smell of death hit him earthy and metallic, mixed with the faint chemical scent of plastic. His mother's body lay motionless under the tarp, her form eerily still, as if time had stopped for her the moment he had plunged the knife into her back. He grabbed the shovel he had taken from the garage earlier and walked into the woods, the ground crunching beneath his boots as branches snapped underfoot. After a few minutes of walking, he found a secluded spot far enough from the road that no one would accidentally stumble upon it. This would have to do. He planted the shovel into the dirt and began to dig. Each scoop felt heavier than the last, his arms aching from the effort, but his mind was on autopilot. He couldn't think about the gravity of what he was doing. He could only focus on the repetitive motion of the shovel, the dull thud of it hitting the ground over and over again. The hole was deep enough after what felt like hours, though in reality, it had only been a short while. Derek made his way back to the car and dragged the tarp-covered body toward the makeshift grave. His mother, once so full of life, was now just a weight in his hands, a burden he was desperate to rid himself of. With one final effort, he heaved her into the grave, the thud of her body hitting the bottom sending a shiver up his spine. Without pausing, he began to cover the body with dirt, each shovelful erasing the visible evidence of his crime. The mound grew smaller, the form of the body disappearing beneath the earth, until finally there was nothing left but a patch of freshly turned soil. Derek stood there, staring at the ground, trying to process what he had done. There was no going back now. He walked back to the car, breathing heavily from the effort, his muscles burning from the physical labor. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the weight of his actions had followed him, invisible but inescapable. He couldn't stay here. He needed to leave, to get far away from the woods, from the body, from the life he had just destroyed. Derek turned the key in the ignition and drove away, the dark woods slowly fading into the distance behind him. But no matter how far he went, he knew that what he had done would never truly disappear. The shadow of his crime would follow him, a ghost that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The drive back to Greenview felt endless, the quiet road stretching out in front of Derek, like a reminder of everything that had just happened. As the familiar suburban streets came back into view, he felt a tightening in his chest. The house on Cedar Lane would be waiting for him, hollow and lifeless without his mother's presence. He had cleaned up the physical evidence, but something much deeper now clung to him, a suffocating sense of guilt that not even the darkest night could hide. He parked the car in the driveway, taking a moment to gather himself before stepping out. His hands were shaking as he locked the door behind him, stepping back into the house where the crime had unfolded. The smell of bleach still lingered, a sharp contrast to the metallic scent of blood that had filled the room just hours earlier. Inside, everything was unnervingly calm. The dining room table was set exactly as it had been before, papers neatly stacked, a coffee cup still resting on the edge. If someone walked in right now, they might think Linda had simply stepped out for a moment. But Derek knew better. He had made sure she would never step through that door again. He moved robotically through the house, switching off lights, trying to force himself into a routine, anything to make the night feel normal. But every corner of the house whispered reminders of what had happened, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the dark truth. In his bedroom, Derek collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, his body aching from the night's work. His mind was numb, refusing to process the full weight of what he had done. He had always imagined that murder would come with a rush of adrenaline or a flood of emotion, but in reality, it had left him feeling hollow. As sleep finally overtook him, he was haunted by flashes of the night, his mother's lifeless body, the sound of the knife piercing flesh, the cold weight of the shovel in his hands. No matter how much he tried to push it away, it lingered in the corners of his mind, waiting to resurface when he least expected it. The next morning the sun crept over the horizon, casting a dull light across the neighborhood. Greenview was slowly waking up to another day, oblivious to the horror that had unfolded at 224 Cedar Lane the night before. For the neighbors, it was just another Friday morning, commuters heading to work, kids waiting for the school bus. For Derek, it was the beginning of his nightmare. He awoke to the sound of birds outside his window, their cheerful chirping a stark contrast to the heaviness that sat in his chest. The events of the previous night flooded back in an instant, and he lay there, staring at the ceiling, paralyzed by the realization of what he had done. He hadn't dreamed it. The body was gone, buried deep in the woods, and his mother was never coming back. But the world around him moved on, as if nothing had happened. The normalcy felt jarring, disorienting. Derek forced himself out of bed, his body sluggish, as if weighed down by invisible chains. He needed to keep up appearances, act like everything was fine. Any deviation from his usual routine would draw suspicion, and he couldn't afford that. In the kitchen, the sunlight streaming through the window seemed harsh, too bright for the grim reality of his life. He made himself coffee, just as his mother had every morning, the small act almost mocking him now. His hands trembled as he poured the hot liquid into a mug, the smell of it filling the air, but his stomach turned at the thought of drinking it. They sat at the table, staring blankly at the papers Linda had been grading the night before. The weight of his actions pressed down harder. He couldn't just sit here. People would start asking questions soon. The school would call when she didn't show up for work. Her friends would wonder where she was. Derek hadn't thought this far ahead. He had only been focused on removing her from his path, not as law, on what came after. The phone rang, its sharp sound cutting through the silence. Derek's heart raced as he stared at it, the shrill ring filling the air with dread. He knew who it was, her school, calling to check on Linda's absence. He let it go to voicemail, his pulse pounding in his ears. He couldn't handle it right now. Not yet. For the rest of the day, Derek moved through the house like a ghost, unsure of what to do next. He was trapped, suffocated by the lies he would have to tell, the explanations he would need to give. Every hour that passed without his mother's presence was another reminder that someone would come looking for her. As evening approached, a knock at the door shattered the fragile calm Derek had managed to build. His heart leapt into his throat as he walked to the door, fear gripping him as he turned the handle. So on the other side stood Mrs. Harding, the elderly neighbor who lived 2 doors down. She smiled warmly, unaware of the darkness that had taken hold of the Stevens household. "So just wanted to check in on Linda," she said, her voice filled with genuine concern. "I haven't seen her all day, and I know she's usually up and about by now." Derek forced a smile, but inside, his panic rose like a wave threatening to crash over him. The questions had already begun, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the lies he spun would start to unravel. Derek's pulse quickened as he faced Mrs. Harding on the doorstep, her concerned eyes narrowing slightly as she awaited a response. He forced a tight smile, trying to appear calm, though the weight of his secret pressed harder with each passing second. "Oh, she's not feeling well," Derek lied, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "Just a little under the weather. I think she caught something from the kids at school. She's resting right now." Mrs. Harding's expression softened with sympathy, but Derek could see her eyes linger on him a bit too long, searching for something, perhaps an explanation for the nervous energy he couldn't quite suppress. She shifted on her feet and nodded slowly, though she didn't seem fully convinced. "Well, tell her I hope she feels better soon," she said kindly, though there was a slight edge of suspicion in her tone. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to come by." Derek nodded quickly, too quickly, and watched her turn and walk back down the driveway. The moment the door closed behind him, his entire body slumped, as though the mere act of holding himself together had drained all his energy. He leaned against the wall, staring at the floor, his thoughts racing. Mrs. Harding had been the first, but others would come. He couldn't keep making excuses indefinitely. The school, her friends, even the police would eventually become involved if she remained missing long enough. Derek needed a plan, but the swirling panic in his mind made it impossible to think clearly. Every option felt like a dead end. The phone rang again, its shrill tone echoing through the quiet house like a hammer on glass. Derek flinched, his stomach twisting in knots, as he checked the caller ID. It was the school again, likely the principal or one of her colleagues, trying to reach her. This time he couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" he answered, his voice strained. "Derek, this is Principal Reynolds." A voice came through the line, firm but not unkind. "I'm trying to get in touch with your mother. She didn't show up for work today, and we've been trying to reach her all morning." Derek swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for a believable story. He knew this conversation was critical. If he made any misstep, if there was even a hint of doubt, the suspicion would grow, and it wouldn't be long before they started asking the wrong kinds of questions. She's been sick," Derek began, his heart pounding. "She's been really out of it since yesterday. I was going to call in for her, but I guess I didn't get around to it. I'm sorry." Principal Reynolds paused for a moment, the silence on the other end of the line thick with tension. "Well, I'm sorry to hear that," the principal finally said. "Please let her know we're thinking of her, and if she's able, have her give us a call to check in. We were just concerned." "I will," Derek replied quickly, his throat dry. "Thank you for checking in." As he hung up, his chest heaved with the weight of the lie. The conversation had bought him some time, but he knew it wouldn't last. If Linda didn't make contact soon, people would begin to get suspicious. He couldn't keep faking her illness forever. Derek paced the living room, his mind racing through scenarios. He couldn't disappear, not with so many people expecting his mother to recover. He couldn't just make her reappear, either. He was stuck in a rapidly closing trap, each lie only tightening the noose around his neck. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety and dread. Derek remained mostly indoors, avoiding the neighbors and ignoring most calls, hoping to delay the inevitable. His excuse about his mother being sick had worked for now, but each interaction felt like another step closer to discovery. Every knock on the door sent his heart racing. Every passing police car made him tense with fear. He was constantly on edge, waiting for everything to collapse. It wasn't long before Linda's friends grew more concerned. She wasn't responding to texts. Her absence from work was becoming too prolonged, and Derek's explanations were starting to wear thin. He avoided going outside during the day, terrified that someone would ask him about her again. But even in the safety of his home, the isolation was suffocating. He was trapped within these walls, the memories of his crime creeping in from every corner. Then, on the 5th day after the murder, a knock at the door shook him to his core. This wasn't Mrs. Harding, or a friendly neighbor dropping by. Derek's stomach churned as he peered through the window. 2 police officers stood at the doorstep, their stern faces a clear sign that they weren't here for casual conversation. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening. He had prepared for this moment in the back of his mind, but now that it was here, all he felt was raw panic. His mind raced. Should he run? Should he try to lie? No, they'd see right through him. He was cornered, and deep down he knew it. Summoning every ounce of calm he had left, Derek opened the door. "Derek Stevens?" one of the officers asked, their gazes sharp and unreadable. Derek nodded, his throat tight. "We're here regarding your mother, Linda Stevens. We've had reports that she hasn't been seen in several days, and her co-workers are concerned. Is everything all right?" The officer's tone was polite but firm, and Derek could feel the weight of their scrutiny as they waited for his response. His mouth went dry, his hands trembled at his sides. He knew he was standing at the edge of a cliff, and with one wrong step, everything would come crashing down. "She's been really sick," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been taking care of her, but I don't know if she's getting better." The officers exchanged a glance, their skepticism evident. One of them stepped forward slightly, his expression hardening. "We'd like to come in and have a look, Derek, just to make sure she's all right." Derek froze. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his lies about to crush him. There was no more room to maneuver, no more time to stall. The officers stood waiting, their eyes locked on him, the silence pressing down like a heavy fog. In that moment, Derek realized there was no escape. The truth, buried deep in the woods, was about to come to the surface, and when it did, everything he had tried so hard to cover up would unravel before his eyes. Derek stood frozen in the doorway, the officer's request to enter hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. His mind raced, but he knew it was over. There was no more room for lies. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and now the consequences had finally caught up with him. "It's all right," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He stepped back, allowing the officers into the house. The moment they entered, the small, darkened home seemed to shrink even more. Derek watched as they moved through the living room, their sharp eyes taking in every detail. So one officer glanced at the kitchen table, where Linda's papers still lay, untouched since that night. The other officer moved toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. "Where is she?" the officer in front of Derek asked, his voice cold, all pretense of concern gone. Derek swallowed hard, his throat tight. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, feel the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. His hands trembled at his sides as the silence stretched out. Unbearable. The truth was teetering on the edge of his lips, ready to spill out. So Derek started, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes darted toward the door, toward the exit, as if some last instinct of survival still whispered at him to run. But where could he go? What would that change now? Finally, with a deep, shaky breath, Derek looked up at the officers, his face pale, his body limp with exhaustion and defeat. "She's not here," he whispered. "I killed her." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, the weight of them crashing down on everyone in the room. The officers froze for a moment, their eyes locking on Derek as the reality of his confession set in. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. I buried her," Derek continued, his voice hollow, as though he were speaking about someone else. "In the woods. I didn't know what to do." The officer closest to him nodded grimly, pulling out a set of handcuffs from his belt. The sound of the metal clicking together as they were tightened around Derek's wrists seemed louder than anything else, echoing in the quiet house. The world outside, so bright and ordinary, felt impossibly far away from the darkness that now consumed Derek's life. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began, his words slow and steady, but Derek barely heard them. The moment was surreal, like watching a film of someone else's life unravel before his eyes. His mind drifted to the night. It had all happened, to the rage and confusion that had consumed him in that instant, an instant that had now destroyed everything. As the officers led him out of the house, Derek caught a glimpse of Mrs. Harding standing in her yard, watching with wide, shocked eyes. The neighborhood had woken up to the sight of police cars in the driveway, and now people stood on their porches, murmuring in confusion and horror. But Derek didn't care. The weight of their judgment didn't matter anymore. The world could know, and he was almost relieved that it did. There was nothing left to hide. The drive to the police station was a blur. Derek sat in the back of the cruiser, his hands cuffed behind him, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. His mind was empty, as though the confession had drained him of everything. In a strange way, it felt like a release, the end of a nightmare he couldn't escape. The relief, however, was fleeting. What lay ahead would be years of facing the darkness he had created. Later, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, Derek told the officers everything. The tension, the arguments, the resentment that had been building for years. He described the moment he had snapped, the cold, terrifying clarity he had felt as he stood over his mother's body, and finally the burial, the desperate, futile attempt to cover up what he had done. The officers listened, their faces grim and unreadable. When it was over, Derek sat in silence, his head bowed. There was no redemption in the confession, only a slow, grinding march toward the inevitable. A few days later, authorities recovered Linda's body from the shallow grave in the woods. The discovery sent shockwaves through the quiet town of Greenview. where the Stevens family had once been just another ordinary household. Now, the house at 224 Cedar Lane stood as a symbol of tragedy, a dark reminder that behind the facade of normalcy, there can be unimaginable darkness. Derek's trial, when it came, was swift. His guilt was undeniable, and the evidence combined with his own confession left no room for doubt. The courtroom was filled with spectators, many of them neighbors, people who had once smiled and waved at Derek and his mother. Now they looked at him with a mixture of horror and pity. The verdict was life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As Derek sat in his cell, the walls closing in around him, he thought about his mother, about the life he had taken, and the future he had destroyed. The silence of the prison echoed the silence of the house he had once lived in. So no matter how far he was from Greenview, the memories, the guilt would follow him. He was forever trapped in the shadow of his own crime. And there, in the confines of his prison cell, Derek realized one undeniable truth. The punishment for his crime had begun the moment he had picked up that knife, and it would never end.